This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos, the best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type in livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar, and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as they put the live in Living with Hemophilia. You can even like them on Facebook. That's even better because then you can use emojis on their Facebook page and receive all the latest updates. So check out Living with Hemophilia, and before you wish happy birthday to some friend from the 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
When my wife and I started dating 8.5 years ago, I knew that she was always interested in adoption. Through our many discussions about our future and what our family would look like, being able to provide a home to someone without one was always part of it. Then in 2011, I traveled to Kenya and had a really profound experience. I was there helping set up a lab and clinic for people with bleeding disorders and saw the truly devastating effects hemophilia had on people there. As I got more involved in international work, I also heard stories of so many kids being given up for adoption because their families couldn't take care of them due to their bleeding disorders. With these experiences, conversations with my wife began to shift towards international adoption, specifically someone with a bleeding disorder. I've also heard this sentiment from several others in our community about the desire to adopt, and I also witnessed some really amazing stories of successful adoptions over the past few years. So on this episode of Ask the Expert, I wanted to find out a little bit more about this process. With that, welcome to episode 15, the adoption episode of the podcast.
Today on Ask the Expert, we are incredibly lucky to have the Adoption, Advocacy, and Outreach Coordinator for the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan, Shari Luckey, on the podcast today. Shari has been connected with the bleeding disorders community her entire life as her brother had hemophilia, and now she has 4 children, all which are affected by bleeding disorders. So thank you, Shari, for being on the podcast today and for sharing your insights into the adoption process, specifically around what it's like to adopt someone with hemophilia.
Thank you for having me.
Could you share a little bit more about your background and your experience within the bleeding disorders community?
So I was born when my brother was 3 years old, and he had severe hemophilia B. So I've really never known life without hemophilia being a part of it. I was diagnosed with mild hemophilia, or being a symptomatic carrier, as they called it at the time, when I was about 19 years old, and had a number of bleeding episodes as a result of having children and dental work and things like that over the years. And then I had my first son, who has severe hemophilia B with inhibitors. And I have twin daughters, and one of them is a carrier, but all 3 of the girls in the family also have a platelet dysfunction. And then we adopted our youngest son in 2010 at the age of 9, and he has severe hemophilia A.
So you also work for the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your role as the Adoption, Advocacy, and Outreach Coordinator?
So I started advocating for children that have bleeding disorders, typically it's hemophilia, who are in need of forever families back in 2010 after we adopted our youngest son, and just kind of doing that with a couple of other moms, scrambling anytime we would find out about a child. And then 3 years ago, the executive director of the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan approached me and asked me how the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan could help. And so through a number of conversations around that issue, it was decided that the best way would be for them to hire me in a part-time capacity so that I could broaden my reach to the hemophilia community about these children that have hemophilia and need forever homes.
Are most of these children international, or are they also located within the United States?
Most of the children I find out about are international through different adoption agents that I have connections with. I'll find out about the kids that have hemophilia and advocate for them. It's been a little more difficult in the domestic adoption areas because the system that we have is really fragmented between all the different states and then even county to county in each state. So it's been difficult to try and find out if there are children in the U.S. that are available for adoption with a bleeding disorder. I have found out about a couple, and it's just been through word of mouth from somebody who's already in the community and connects me with the caseworker, but it's been very difficult to make those connections.
So it seems like it's almost more challenging just to specifically find somebody with hemophilia to adopt in the U.S.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you adopted before you had this role with the chapter and were even involved in this. So what made you choose to adopt, first of all, adopt period and specifically somebody with hemophilia?
After my oldest son was born, and with his inhibitor and allergy to factor, we had looked into adoption at that time. We were a little nervous to try again. And at the time, the costs were just not something that we could handle. We had looked internationally specifically, and so years later, after we had our twins and thought our family was complete, we actually had received an email from Lori Kelly, who had found out about our son specifically that was living in an orphanage. And he hadn't been made ready for adoption. So another mom who was adopting a little girl and happened to have a biological child with hemophilia ended up hearing about our son specifically from her agent. And at the time, he hadn't been made ready for adoption, and they didn't think that he was a child who would be adopted because of his hemophilia. So through some education from this mom in the hemophilia community, he was made ready for adoption. Then Lori Kelly sent out the email, and my husband and I both saw it and just really felt the pull to get more information. And once we contacted the adoption agent and downloaded his file and saw his photos and learned more about him, we were convinced that that was what we wanted to do. And then our 3 kids were also on board with that.
How old was your son when you adopted him, and what country was he from?
He was from China, and we adopted him. We brought him home when he was 9.
Oh, when he was 9. Okay. Awesome. So you mentioned being made ready for adoption. What does that mean? And once you decided that this was something you wanted to pursue, like what was a brief overview of the process?
So in China specifically, the children that are in orphanages aren't all made available for adoption. So each orphanage has to choose the children that will be made ready based on how adoptable they think the child is, because it costs money for them to do all the paperwork and everything on their end for the child to be considered ready. They have to do medical exams and fill out a bunch of paperwork. And so they kind of have to choose which children, I guess, have the best chance of being adopted. And so up until we adopted Luke, I don't think there were really very many children in China that had hemophilia that they were making ready for adoption. And then on our end, the first step in any adoption, whether it's domestic or international, is to have a home study. And a home study is where a local agency will come in, and there's a lot of paperwork to fill out. They want copies of, marriage license and all that kind of stuff. And then they come into your home and interview you and make sure that you're healthy and that your home is safe and that you would be considered a good family to adopt whatever age child it is that you're looking to adopt. If it's an international adoption, you would go specifically to an agency that is a Hague agency, and Hague are the laws that surround international adoption.
When you said that there's different requirements based on the age of the child you're going to adopt, what were like some of the specifics they were looking for that age group?
For an older child, there's more education that you have to do. So we had to do online classes. So since he was older, there were more classes we had to do that talk about different issues that can be involved with an older child, issues surrounding adapting to the new environment and bonding with your family, bonding with the child. Different requirements for different ages, with education particularly.
So after the home visit and they cleared you for that, what were the next steps after that?
It's hurry up and fill out a bunch of paperwork and turn it in, and then you wait. So, again, you have to get your dossier ready, and that's just all the information that you have to collect. So you have to collect your medical exams, all of your legal papers, and different fees that come through along the way. You get everything looked at, and everything has to be legally verified. Then that's sent off to the country, and then they go through their process of verifying everything that you've sent them.
Was there any real strange requests that you weren't expecting them to ask, or were you pretty well prepared for everything they were going to ask for?
I think we were pretty well prepared. I know people who maybe have moved around a lot to different states, and some of them have had a little more trouble because you have to get documents from the different states that you've lived in and things like that. So we didn't have that because my husband and I both grew up in Michigan, so we didn't have that issue at all.
Is it at that point that they decide that it looks like you're good to go for the adoption?
That's pretty much it. You go through the steps on this side when the U.S. says that you have everything and they're satisfied. It all goes to the other country, and they go through their process, and once you're approved, you're then set up with a date for finalizing your adoption there, and then you arrange your travel around that when you'll meet the child, and there's different things you have to do in China. In China, we were there about 21 days. You initially go to the province that the child is from, and you stay there for a week or so, and then everyone goes to Guangzhou, and that's where everything is finalized.
So at that point, were you able to kind of spend a lot of time with your son, or was he basically with you from then on?
He was with us. So we arrived in his city the night before we met him, and typically there's a group of people that all go to the office, and they bring the children in, and you meet your child, and you stay there for quite a little while, and then you go back to the hotel, and the child is with you from then on.
Oh, that's cool. Did you go with just your husband, or was the whole family there for that experience?
It was just my husband and I. We didn't want to take the kids out of school, and it's quite an expensive trip, too.
What were the feelings like the night before you got to pick up your son? What was that feeling going through your head? A
lot of excitement, but also a lot of nervousness. It's a big step, so concerns: are we doing the right thing? How is this going to go? Is everybody going to get along? Those kind of things. Is everybody going to be able to bond and, feel like a family? So we were very nervous, but also very, very excited.
There's probably a pretty big culture difference. Did you guys speak Chinese? Did he speak any English? Was there any language barrier? What were those kind of challenges initially?
The language barrier was huge. So he didn't know any English at all except for hello, and we did not know Chinese. So it was, and the little bit that we thought we had picked up, we pronounced horribly. So, for us, and every child is different, but for us, our son was able to pick up pretty quickly on, just conversational speech. And so I would say by the time we came home, he was saying at least 50 words and already putting words together, starting to write words down and try to sound them out. And he was very, very excited to learn English. Not all kids are. Some kids want to continue speaking Mandarin. So every child is different, just like having biological children. I have 3 biological children, and every one of them is completely different, even the twins. So every situation's different. But yeah, but it was a challenge. I mean, the communication. He was old enough that we were able to use Google Translate, and that helped a lot, although sometimes the translation wasn't exactly accurate. So that also was sometimes frustrating.
This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Living with Hemophilia, the online community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for a plethora of useful info like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, leadership opportunities and initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos. The best videos. And because it's on the internet, it's easy to find. Simply type livingwithhemophilia.com into your search bar and there you are. Thank you, Internet. Join Bayer's community of fellow hemophilia patients, caregivers, and advocates as they put the live in living with hemophilia. You can even like them on Facebook, and that's even better because then you can use emojis on their Facebook page and receive all the latest updates. So, check out Living with Hemophilia. And before you wish happy birthday to that friend from 3rd grade or share a funny meme about cats and Mondays, head over to Facebook and like Bayer's Living with Hemophilia page. You'll be glad you did.
So you guys were with him from day one while you were in China. You had 21 more days, so you traveled to the other city. You had to go through a bunch of processes there. What did that look like?
There's not a lot that you have to do other than the first day we went and we received our son, and then we had to go back the next day to the same office, and you fill out some paperwork and the child agrees that yes, they want to be adopted. They actually ask them if they're old enough, and so he had to agree that yes, he wanted to be adopted, and we filled some stuff out and signed it, and that was really all the paperwork that we had to do in his city. They have to keep you there for a certain amount of time and get all the paperwork processed. So then we just went and did things each day with the other families that we were there with. So we got to go see some of his city and do some fun things. And then when we went to Guangzhou, they all have to have their medical examination. The finalization of the adoption happens right at the end of the trip. But again, there wasn't a lot of paperwork and stuff that we had to do there. It was just kind of waiting for everything to get processed. So we did sightseeing and went to the zoo and did day trips and things like that. So we were able to have some fun and, see a little bit of China while we were there too.
Excellent. So you kind of had a little bit of bonding time. What was it like when you guys arrived home for the first time?
When we arrived home, it was February in Michigan, and so Luke got to see a lot of snow for the first time. So that was pretty exciting for him. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he's considered a U.S. citizen, so that was super exciting for my husband and I. But then you have to stand in the long line and go through customs. Everyone was very nice there and, welcomed him to the U.S. and, but it was just very tiring. And fortunately, we had somebody that picked us up. And then when we got back to the house, some of our close family was waiting for us. And the neighbors had made a sign that was hung up in Mandarin that said, "Welcome home, Luke." And so it was pretty neat. Yeah. He had a Chinese passport. And then we had the paperwork from China about the adoption that had been translated into English. So we had all of that. And then in Michigan, that was the way it worked. We didn't have to do anything else as far as making the adoption official. Some states, there's another step that you have to do to make it official. And I unfortunately, I can't tell you what states that is, but the only thing I had to do was apply for Social Security card and, do all of that kind of stuff. But he was immediately covered by our insurance for health, and it was a relatively straightforward, simple process for us. We had given our health insurance company a heads up before we left, and they told us what we needed to turn in. So we were prepared for that and sent all that in. And so we were able to take him to the Hemophilia Treatment Center 3 days after we got home and, didn't have any problems with anything getting paid.
I was going to ask a little bit about that medical process. Since you are adopting somebody with a bleeding disorder, I'm sure that has a couple of kinks in it. What about that transition time when he was still in China? Were you able to get him any factor in China while he was waiting? How did that process work?
We were not able to access factor when we were in China, but from what I understand, that's changing. There have been several families that have gone over and their child has had a bleed while they were there, and they were actually able to purchase a dose of medication for their child for not a huge amount of money. You know, there is the ability to get it. Typically, it's a very small dose.
Right.
So it's not like when you're here, you get a dose that's measured out for your particular size. So it's usually a pretty small dose, but you can purchase it there now in certain provinces. It also depends on where you are.
And that's probably more specifically for China and not other countries. Your son was also 9 years old when you adopted him. Were there any like lasting effects of his hemophilia as far as like joint issues? And then also, I'm just kind of curious, like, how did you explain infusions and having to prophylactically treat when you were back home with the language barrier?
When we had arranged our first hemophilia treatment center visit, we had arranged that before we left. So we had it all set up. And at the time, we requested to have a Mandarin translator there at the visit with us. And so we were able to use the translator to help communicate and explain, you know, what the process was like. And he knew about needles. He wasn't getting factor, but he was getting we're pretty sure it was cryoprecipitate, just based on his description of the process. So he was used to getting, you know, a needle, but not having immediate results. So he happened to have a bleed going when we went to that first HTC visit. And so they immediately drew his labs and put a rush on them. So we actually waited all day at the treatment center that day because they wanted to treat him and they needed to get his lab results back. So when they got the lab results back, we were able to go ahead and give him medication. And when he got up the next morning, he came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and he said, "Medicine good," and put his thumb up. And, you know, he was like, it was all better. And he was just amazed because that had never happened before. So for him, he's never had any issues doing his infusions. He knows what it's like not to have the medicine. And so he is on schedule all the time, 3 times a week getting his medication, and he's completely independent now. But prior to that, he was, you know, he knew what day he was supposed to get it, and he'd get the bag out, and it was time to get it.
You mentioned at the beginning, you know, one of the big hurdles for you guys for adoption would always be the cost.
For international adoption, it's typically between $35,000 and $45,000. And that includes your trip over there, your time staying there, you know, and I'm sure it can go above or below depending on airfare costs and things like that. But the average is between $35,000 and $45,000 for China and Bulgaria both. And then from what I understand, that's typical for any country that's international. Domestically, it varies. If it's adoption through foster care, there isn't necessarily a charge unless you have to get something done through a lawyer, and then there would be that charge. Private adoptions in the U.S. can be extremely expensive as well, though.
So are there any grants or anything that you can apply for that would help with the costs of adoption?
There are adoption grants, nothing specific for hemophilia yet. I am hoping that at some point we can get something specific for hemophilia. You can just search by Googling, but I have put together a list of grants that I've searched for, and I'm happy to send that information to anyone who is interested.
And are those generally like pretty hard to get, or did you guys apply for any grants, or were you able to kind of absorb the costs on your own?
We did not apply for any grants, but we did have a fundraiser that brought in quite a nice amount of money that offset some of the cost. But we did absorb the majority of the cost on our own. But I've seen families that have fundraised between grants and fundraising. They've gotten the full amount of their adoption taken care of.
The process you described was the process for adoption in China. And that was, you said it was a little while ago. Are the processes kind of similar in other countries, or is it country specific?
The Hague Convention, there's certain things that they require on our end over here, which is the home study that you get done. And that's for international adoption. So that would be pretty much the same. But each country does have their own requirements as well. So I kind of learn about the countries as I'm going along. So I know the most about China, but even since we've adopted, other families have, had different experiences because they do change things a little bit. But I know for China, it's one trip. When you go, you meet your child and take custody of your child all in one trip. For some other countries, there's 2 to 3 visits that have to be done. You go and you meet your child, and then you go back again. And I know there's at least one country that you have to make 3 trips for the adoption. So again, I kind of, as I'm going along and different countries pop up that I'm trying to help, I'm learning more about the different countries, but I don't know. Bulgaria and China so far are the ones that I'm most familiar with.
My wife and I have been looking into adoption internationally for a little while now, and we've noticed just, doing some Google searches that all the countries have like little nuances that you have to figure out as you go forward, which is kind of interesting. For example, my wife and I are interested in international adoption. It seems incredibly stressful to begin this process, and it's kind of hard to figure out where to even start. What would be your big suggestions for somebody that is interested in international adoption, specifically looking for somebody with a bleeding disorder?
Well, contact me. The first step is getting that home study. So, if you're thinking you want to adopt in the next year or two, you want to find an agency. If you want to do international adoption, you need to find a Hague accredited agency and start talking with them about getting a home study done. Home studies can take anywhere from a month to 6 months, and then they're good for about a year. And those can vary depending on what state you live in as well. My understanding in most states is you can renew them for a lot easier. So if you've done your home study and you have a year and you haven't been matched with a child, my understanding is you can update the home study pretty easily and for little expense. So getting the home study is the very first thing. And then once you have a home study, if you're specifically looking for a child with hemophilia, we do have a Facebook advocacy group that quite a few of us are on, and try and keep that updated with new children. And I try to really make sure I know what kids are waiting. And so I'm a great resource if you're, looking, contacting me. And I'm happy for you guys to post my email address, or I can give it so that people can contact me. Again, the home study would be first, and then making connections to find those kids that have hemophilia that are waiting.
Is that home study work for any country that you're interested in adopting from, or do you have to do like separate ones for each country?
If you do the Hague accredited agency, I believe that works for any country, but I do think certain agencies only do certain countries. So you would want to check that locally with your agency. In my case, we used 2 agencies because we did our home study locally, but the agency that had our son's file was in New York. And that's pretty common for that to happen, to have to do your home study through a local agency, and then they communicate with your agency that has the child's file.
How do you pick an agency? What process did you guys use? How do you make sure you're going with like a reputable agency?
I actually used the phone book, but 2010 doesn't seem that long ago, but I don't know. Because we kind of did things a little bit backwards, we found out about Luke and then we had to start the process. So I opened the phone book and started looking at adoption agencies and called a few, and we just happened to have a really good international adoption agency right in our town, and, just did some, quick searching to make sure that they didn't have any, bad reviews, and I didn't even know anything about being Hague accredited, but just in talking with the social worker that I had contacted, she told me all about the Hague accreditation. And, so we did a very quick, because we were kind of in a time crunch. But there's reviews out there that you can read about, both local agencies and then, agencies that might be in another state that are handling the actual adoption, reaching out to others in the community. We actually have a community now of hemophilia adoption parents. And so we have some online resources with that to get connected to those folks. And a lot of people who have adopted much more recently than I have that I usually refer people to as far as questions about the process now. But lots of information out there about the agencies that handle international adoption to see if they're a good one. I will say it's probably the most rewarding thing that my family has done. And while the process is not always easy, it was worth it for us. And when our son came home, it wasn't always easy. Transition is challenging. And, there were times when I thought, oh my goodness, what have we done? But we were able to work through the process. And we've got a blessed family, and we love our children all equally. And it's just been a wonderfully rewarding thing. And I can't imagine not having our youngest son. He's been a real blessing to our family.
Amazing. And thank you for choosing to adopt too. I think it's very inspiring for me to hear these stories, especially since I've traveled so much to developing countries where access to hemophilia care is very limited. I know it makes a huge impact on the lives of these individuals with bleeding disorders. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have you checked out Living with Hemophilia yet? If you have, kudos to you. Not only are you eager to join this exciting community of discourse and helpful information, you're also a keen listener and patron of the arts. But if you haven't taken a swim through livingwithhemophilia.com, take a moment to pull it up on the old internet. I think you're going to love it. Helpful content, relevant updates, and most of all, a bunch of people going through the same things you are. It's a growing part of the online Living with Hemophilia community brought together by the good people at Bayer. Also, put it on your Facebook to-do list. Hit the like button on Living with Hemophilia's Facebook page. It's a good alternative to looking at the slideshow of your neighbor's recent foot surgery. Unless you're into that sort of thing. Living with Hemophilia from Bayer. Check it out.
And that's a wrap for episode 15 of the Ask the Expert podcast. Huge thanks again to Shari Luckey for sharing about her family's adoption journey and for sharing so much information about the adoption process. I know that was a huge help for myself and hopefully for you all as well. To contact Shari, please visit the link to the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan's adoption page in the program notes. I'd also love to say thank you to our sponsor, Living with Hemophilia, the online hemophilia community brought to you by Bayer. Living with Hemophilia is the destination of choice for tons of useful information, like medical and non-medical tips, helpful advice, information on programs for all ages and stages, amazing global leadership initiatives, sewing patterns, and videos. Please visit their website, livingwithhemophilia.com, and like their similarly named Facebook page. And that is all for episode 15 of the Ask the Expert podcast. We'll be back next month with another expert interview. BloodstreamMedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community. Once on BloodstreamMedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast, Ask the Expert podcast, Powering Through podcast, and the Bloodline podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question you would like to hear an expert answer to? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You also find Bloodstream Media on Facebook at facebook.com/Bloodstream Media and on Twitter at Bloodstream Info. This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Chris Bombardier, produced by Patrick James Lynch, Rob Bradford, Joshua Sterling Bragg, Alva Friedman, and Colby Crow. Artwork by Ryan Geelan and Katie Wright Mead, and the Ask the Expert pod is edited by Allison Stoney. I'm your host, Chris Bombardier, and until next time, keep on climbing.